Welcome to the 17th Annual Allan Martin Lecture, a celebration of the vitality of the discipline of history here at the Australian National University and in Australian public culture. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, paying respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and recognising the continuity of their culture and sovereignty. Before we hear from our lecturer for this evening, Dr. Michael McKernan, I want to tell you a little about the importance of the Allan Martin Lecture to the School of History and also about Allan Martin, in whose memory this lecture series was established by Professor Beryl Rawson, who was his wife, as well as herself, of course, an eminent social historian of classical Rome. Allan was born in 1926, served in the Royal Australian Air Force during the Second World War, and was educated at the University of Sydney and the Australian National University, where, with Russell Ward and Eric Fry, he was among the first three doctoral students in history at this university. After teaching at the University of New South Wales, which was still the experimental New South Wales University of Technology in those days, and then the Universities of Melbourne and Adelaide, Allan became Foundation Chair of History at La Trobe University in 1966. There, he encouraged a lively group of staff and students to bring the insights and methods of political science, law and sociology to history, his engagement with sociology being greatly influenced by the work of his first wife, Jean Martin, who was, of course, a distinguished sociologist. And at La Trobe, he created a very great history department. Allan played a major role in shaping the field of Australian political history and biography. In 1973, he returned to the history program of the Research School of Social Sciences over in that Coombs building. Here, he published two magisterial biographies of Henry Parkes and Robert Menzies. A famously kind, self-effacing and gentle man, he was also a generous supervisor and mentor to graduate students, not only his own, but more generally through seminars on the theory and philosophy of history and biography. I certainly benefited from his wisdom, and you will have seen a smiling 22-year-old PhD student there in the early 90s a few moments ago. Allan Martin Week, this year being run in conjunction with Alumni Week, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the many people who've helped to bring tonight's events together. It's been a massive effort. Offers an opportunity to draw together the broader community of the School of History to recapture the qualities that Allan epitomised as a scholar. Our Allan Martin lecturer for this year, Dr. Michael McKernan, completed both his undergraduate and doctoral studies at the ANU. Subsequently, like Allan Martin, he taught for a number of years at the University of New South Wales before pursuing a career as a historian at the Australian War Memorial. He has been one of Australia's most prolific and influential social historians, especially in the field of war and society. His doctoral work, which became an important book, explored the Church's role in the First World War. There then came two superb social histories of the Australian home front, the Australian people and the Great War, and its sequel, All In, Australia during the Second World War, a splendid history. And what a boon those books were to those of us in the Victorian High School certificate in the 1980s. There was virtually a black market in them. There has since been a remarkable body of writing in both history and biography, including a history of the Australian War Memorial, where Michael was Deputy Director, a biography of Beryl Beaurepaire, and many more books on topics encompassing war, sport, local, environmental and family history. Michael played a central role in the repatriation of the unknown soldier to Australia in 1993, and he's had a remarkable career spanning universities, museums, and public history more generally. Michael will also be known to many of you here as a regular reviewer of books and a media commentator. Over many decades, he's performed an immense labour with distinction in educating Australians about their own history in a remarkable variety of ways. Michael's has been a rich life in history, and we're very proud to be able to call him both a colleague and an ANU alumnus. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Michael McKernan back to the Australian National University for his intriguingly titled lecture, Be very careful, Michael. They think up there. Reflections on a Historian's Life. Thank you, Michael.
We meet this evening in the Research School of Social Sciences building. The school has moved from the Coombs building, I'm not the first one to say that tonight, to its new location, which is not yet named after a prominent politician, scholar, bureaucrat, university identity, or, dare I imagine it, a generous sponsor. Unlike so many other buildings on the campus, it is not named, but they are the Copeland Building, the Menzies Library, the J.B. Chifley Building, the Hancock Library, the Birch Building, the Beryl Rawson Building, just to name a few of the 163, approximately, buildings on campus. Universities depend for their growth and status on their histories, on what was achieved in the past. To some extent, this is the reason for the naming of their buildings. Few students walking past the Birch Building, home now to the Research School of Chemistry, would reflect on the achievements and significance of Arthur Birch, known as the father of the contraceptive pill, but they might. But such ancient naming policies can be less permanent than they might seem. We had the wonderful and comfortable Manning Clark lecture theatres bowled over a dozen or so years ago after their arrival. Given Clark's suspicion and occasional hostility to the RSSS historians in the past, I doubt it would be appropriate to transfer the Manning Clark name to this building. As Frank has said, Allan Martin arrived at the Research School of Social Sciences in 1955 as the Department of History's first doctoral student. After a distinguished teaching career in various state universities, Allan returned to History RSSS in 1974 as I was finishing my thesis. I met with Allan and others at morning and afternoon tea in the justly famous Coombs Tea Room, but had little else to do with him, and then I left for the University of New South Wales. My next dealing with Allan was not encouraging. In 1977, I was appointed co-editor of the Australian Historical Association Bulletin. I might note that then the AHA had 119 financial members. It wasn't going very well. Professor Ken Inglis was embarking on his adventure to sell the Bicentennial History Project to history academics across the country. I offered him space in the bulletin for him to outline his proposal and invited a couple of academics to comment on it. The commentary was not supportive of Ken's proposal. Indeed, Professor Beverly Kingston wrote, "The Slice volumes have my complete disapproval." As I will explain later, I had every reason to be deeply grateful to Ken Inglis for a timely intervention in my starting scholarly career, and I had no intention whatsoever of undermining the project or the man I regarded most highly in academic life. But Allan Martin thought I'd ambushed Ken and wrote me a stinging and angry letter. It showed his sense of loyalty to Ken Inglis and his own determination to insist on appropriate academic standards. I replied, and soon our correspondence was respectful and friendly. Allan wrote for the next issue of the Bulletin, so we must have buried the hatchet. Whenever we met, Allan was affable, friendly, and interested in what was going on in the profession. He never referred to that incident again. I was able to convince Allan that far from being antagonistic to the ANU, as he had assumed, I regarded this university with the greatest affection as the place where my historical understanding had been nurtured. I explained that it was such a privilege to work among some of the finest historians teaching and writing in Australia, in both the School of General Studies and the Research School of Social Sciences. I arrived at the ANU in February 1968, soon to turn 23. All incoming arts students, I think, were required to make an appointment with Pat White, Sub-Dean of the Arts Faculty, in her office on the ground floor of the Hayden Allen Building. After a pleasant and friendly welcome, Miss White, as she was known, reviewed my matriculation record, even though I had matriculated in 1962, and looked over my intended study program. I was hoping to major in history and to enter the History Honours School. So she made an appointment for me with the head of the department, Professor McWilliams. What pastoral care! I then attended the Vice-Chancellor's welcome to new students. This was held in the Childers Street Hall on an extremely hot morning in February. The Childers Street Hall was a wooden building, iron-roofed, a depressing leftover from Second World War Canberra. I learned today that it was in fact brought to Canberra from Wagga Wagga, which may account for its frankly dumpy nature. And it couldn't be dressed up to look as though it belonged in a university. Canberra also then was in a severe drought and generally looked terrible. It wasn't a good beginning in Canberra. The Vice-Chancellor, Sir John Crawford, was a short man, and as the students were standing to fit them all into the hall, it was difficult to see him clearly. It was almost impossible to hear him as over the noise of the industrial-sized fans brought in to help in the heat. Improbably, but truly, the Childers Street Hall did not boast microphones or amplification. It was decided to turn the fans off so that the students could hear their Vice-Chancellor. This was an unwise decision because the hall soon became unbearably hot. I left the hall early and read the Vice-Chancellor's address in the next day's Canberra Times. It was a dispiriting message. Sir John stated that there was a view among the student body that the university was a sanctuary or a refuge which the police could not enter without the permission of the university authorities. This was not true, the Vice-Chancellor proclaimed. If students broke the law, the university would cooperate with the police in bringing them to justice. Without spelling it out, Sir John was speaking directly to potential draft dodgers, young men who at 20 were required to register for national service in the army. The interest of staff in their students in the School of General Studies never lessened, in my experience, during the 4 years of my undergraduate life. Staff members became friends, or perhaps more accurately, were friendly. I remember with great affection and the highest regard a roll call of historians and others who were so dedicated in getting the very best out of their students. Among those men and women who taught me were Don Baker, Bruce Kent, John Molony, Barbara Penny, Dorothy Green, Bill Mandel, Hector Kinloch, Eric Fry and Daphne Gollan. I salute and honour every single one of them. I never passed Professor Clark in the corridors or on the stairs of the Hayden Allen building without being offered a comment from him, which I often found mystifying. The I being singular, he might say, or give them the glory. We were a large honours year, the largest the department had yet had, and things were rearranged for us with just one class a week in the first half of the year and the honours thesis due in July. Then we had intensive classwork for the rest of the year. Professor Clark traditionally held a party after the results came out for the fourth year students. Famously, he placed a laurel wreath on the head of the student who took first place in the year. Towards the end of the academic year 1971, he invited our group to his party. We replied through our spokeswoman that we would love to have a party, so long as it was held before the results were released. So a tradition died, never to be revived. Once the examination period came to an end, I took a job with the ANU administration, carefully driving the university's Mini Morris van. Now, can you believe that the ANU had a Mini Morris van? Around the campus, I ferried student files from student admin to faculty and departmental offices and back again. I continued once the examination results had been posted, dealing now with incoming student files. Hard work, of course, but it tided me over while I waited to see if I would be awarded a postgraduate scholarship. Travelling to every part of the university and seeing at first hand the diversity of the intellectual offerings and the care with which student results were treated reinforced my respect for the ANU. I accepted an offer for doctoral study in History, Research School of Social Sciences. Running into Professor Clark on the stairwell of the Hayden-Allan building with a sack full of files, I told him of what I perceived was my good fortune. He looked at me somewhat sorrowfully and leaned into me, speaking softly as always. "Be very careful, Michael. They think up there." Then he was off and I dragged my files to the departmental office, thinking, careful, sure and considered, and crucially, informed by a knowledge of and an understanding of the past, is at the heart of, is the essence of, good academic and institutional leadership. So perhaps it was good that they thought up there. I would later discover through the publication of his letters, mainly, that Manning Clark harboured a hefty resentment of his colleagues in the Research School of Social Sciences. He believed that the thinkers looked down on him and his team in the School of General Studies as plodders, if not worse. He referred to the Department of History, RSSS, as the Standards Laboratory. I met with the new head of the department. I met with the head of my new department, Professor John Nauze, who told me that as he would be retiring in 3 years, he was looking for one last good student to supervise. Might I be that student? Quite frankly, I didn't know. But for a while I was quite unnerved by the thought of all the thinking going on behind those firmly closed and solid doors. John Nauze, I soon discovered, was a shy man, very kindly, who used a cutting tongue to protect himself in his shyness. He was an engaged and meticulous historian and a demanding supervisor. I was required from the beginning of my candidature to provide a piece of written work to him by Wednesday afternoon each week in term. He would read it overnight and then discuss it with me the next morning, Thursday morning. I had chosen to work on the responses and reactions of the Australian churches to the First World War. Nauze told me disarmingly that he knew nothing about churches and religion and very little about war. But he said he would do his best for me. Goodness knows what rubbish I must have dished up to him in the first months of my thesis work, but he ploughed through it, generously teaching me about history and writing. Quite early on in this process, Professor Nauze, we were never on first name terms until I graduated, told me that I would be having a sandwich lunch the next day at University House with the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Papua New Guinea, Professor Inglis. Inglis knew a great deal about churches and about war, Nauze told me, and I might learn a great deal from him. At least, Nauze said, in typical Nauzean style, it would do me no harm. Did I reflect on the generosity Professor Inglis showed in helping me? I hope so. Vice-Chancellor of a new university in a country not yet independent from Australia, with surely a raft of meetings in Canberra during his fleeting visit to the capital, with ministers, senior public servants, university administrators, seeking resources, ideas, collaborations. Even so, he had made time for a student at the very beginning of his study. Professor Inglis, Ken, he emphasised, was a very tall, youthful-looking man. He was then 41 years of age, softly spoken, like Manning Clark, and surprisingly respectful of his lunch guest. That hour or so with Ken Inglis was undoubtedly the most important hour of my time as a doctoral student. In a gentle, wondering fashion, Ken Inglis drew out of me what I intended to show in my thesis. He asked me about my understanding of church and of the interaction between church and society. He asked me if I intended to study the work of the chaplains in the Australian Imperial Force, as likely to throw light on the interactions between churchmen and the men in the trenches. He wondered if I had yet used the collections of the Australian War Memorial, and was not too shocked when I admitted I did not know that the War Memorial contained a library or what might be in it. He explained the wealth of the archival holdings there, among the best in the world, he told me. I do not know what he reported back to John Nauze, if anything, but he had given me an agenda for a great deal of research. It wasn't long before I was a familiar in the library at the Australian War Memorial. I'd met and discussed my project with Arthur Basley, Charles Bean's batman during the war, factotum and friend thereafter, and long-term memorial employee. Baz, 76 years of age in 1972, the year in which he died, knew more about the archival collections of the memorial than any other person ever would. He helped me to an invaluable collection of Chaplin's diaries, letters and reflections, which would provide the bulk of 2 chapters of my thesis. Ken Inglis asked me to remember him to Baz, so I had the dream introduction. I quickly became a trusted reader and soon was given unfettered access to the collection. I could walk along the rows and rows of shelving, taking things off the shelves and to my desk in the reading room without the burden of any staff supervision. It was a dangerous and unwise liberality, leading possibly to theft or, just as bad, misfiling of returning items or simply mishandling. But it was immensely helpful to me. Browsing, I discovered the remarkable breadth of the memorial's holdings. When bored with the doings of chaplains, I would immerse myself in the school annuals, bewildered to discover that schoolboys during the war, on leaving school, many of them, went together as a group to the recruiting sergeants. I read their poems and their accounts of incidents at the war, unfiltered apart from some field censorship. I glimpsed the possibility of a book, just in that collection alone, that would eventually be The Australian People and the Great War. In its collection policies, so remarkably wide, the memorial had shown me the possibilities for the story of Australia at war beyond battles and soldiers. My book would place schoolchildren, women, bishops, priests and ministers, sportsmen, farmers and workers front and centre. Few, if any, Australian historians looked then at women and children for their understandings of Australian life at war. The War Memorial had shown me the way. The Australian War Memorial came to mean a great deal to me. With a small number of staff in their jobs, most of them for many years, with unchanging exhibitions, with very few outside researchers, 1 or 2 at the most, with little interest being shown anywhere in Australian military history, and with one of the greatest but unknown collections of the First World War in the world, there is an air of defeatism or irrelevance about the place that is now almost impossible to understand. A new and activist director, Noel Flanagan, wanted great change. Key members of council supported him, including Professor Brian Gandevia, a professor of medicine at the University of New South Wales, a highly regarded expert in diseases of the chest, a Korean War medical veteran, and an expert and published historian. Gandevia was then 47 years of age and at the height of his powers. He and I became good friends after I moved to the University of New South Wales at the start of 1975. Gandevia, understanding how history worked, wanted to apply his insights to the memorial. He wanted to create a research grant scheme to draw academics to the memorial. Then he wanted to establish an annual AWM history conference to ignite interest in military history and encourage debate and new ways of looking at things. He wanted an academically qualified and suitably senior historian to develop these programs, to build a professional staff and attract mainstream historians to the field. The memorial had entirely lost its way in the presentation of history, possibly since the death of John Treloar in 1952. In seeking to expand its exhibitions or outline a different story, staff relied entirely on Bean and Gavin Long's official histories and sought no other views. A professional historian was needed to open a broader understanding of the past, discuss the possibilities of new interpretations, and help to create an atmosphere in which debate thrived. I received that appointment on secondment from my university position and decided that I needed to better understand the place where I would be working. It was expected that I would continue to research, write and publish books and articles, and several of my books come from this period. Eventually, I suppose, as a demonstration of the importance of the past to the memorial, the Council commissioned me to write the memorial's history. This was published in 1991 as Here is Their Spirit, a history of the Australian War Memorial, 1917 to 1990. I had first visited the memorial with my father in 1961. We had searched the Roll of Honour for the names of my mother's two uncles, both in the 14th Battalion, both killed in 1918. I knew that my grandfather kept his two older brothers in the forefront of his memory throughout his life, but now I came to understand more of what Charles Bean, the founder of the memorial, was trying to achieve with the Roll of Honour and the Hall of Memory. Bean realised that few Australians then, or into the foreseeable future, would have the opportunity of visiting the battlefield cemeteries of Gallipoli, the Western Front and the Middle East, to grieve for their loved one in front of the grave. They would be able to do this, Bean believed, at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, with the names engraved in bronze on the walls, with the Hall of Memory as a central commemorative space. But Charles Bean also began collecting the evidence of the Australians at war through a newly created Australian War Record Section, 1917, headed by an enterprising young Army Captain, John Linton Treloar. Treloar became the second director of the memorial and Bean's closest collaborator on this national project. But Charles Bean had the words. In September 1917, he had written that the Australian War Record Section would, quote, preserve and tenderly care for the sacred things that will one day constitute the greatest public possession Australia will have. Much later in his life, but still as chairman of the memorial's board, Charles Bean set out again his vision for the memorial. The purpose of the memorial is to preserve the memory of the men and women of our fighting services who gave their lives in our country's wars. The display of relics and pictures in the galleries is a vivid means of keeping their memory green. It should be in keeping with the character and probable wishes of those it commemorates. I'll just read that last line again. It should be in keeping with the character and probable wishes of those whom it commemorates. Bean recognised from the beginning that only those Australians who had lived on the front line or had seen it could really understand the horror and evil of modern warfare and the appalling conditions that all frontline troops endured. But he would try, through objects, paintings, dioramas and plan models, to give some understanding. Bean and Treloar agreed to collect about 20 uniforms, but one of them was of very special significance. Staff asked a soldier, George Giles, coming out of the line, covered in mud and slime after several days of frontline service, to strip off. They provided him with a fresh uniform and carefully packed his used clothes. Giles was probably a random choice, although it transpired that he was a very good choice. Enlisting at 33 in 1916, married, he was awarded the Military Medal at Villa-Bretonneux. Look at the puttees and the trousers and jacket, thickly coated in mud and on display in the memorial's Western Front Gallery since 1941. Perhaps this display conveys the awfulness and disgust of war as eloquently as any other display. When I started work at the War Memorial, I found a small but dedicated and enthusiastic staff, a passionate group of volunteer guides, and a public that was deeply invested in the memorial and its meaning. We proposed moving some of the dioramas, perhaps retiring one or two. The public outcry was ferocious, and it must be asked, where had this public come from? When years earlier the memorial's management decided to retire the plan models over which Charles Bean had given such extraordinary attention, there was no public outcry. In fact, no one seemed to notice. Depicting the principal battle sites of the Australian Imperial Force in all its theatres, rendered with complete accuracy to give visitors the best possible understanding of the terrain over which the Australians had fought and the challenges they had faced and had overcome. There was a plan model of Gallipoli, the Somme battlefield, of Peronne and Mont-Saint-Quentin battlefield, Villebretigny and Flanders. Bean and Treloar devoted enormous energy towards ensuring their accuracy. Indeed, when the plan models were on display in Melbourne and Sydney in the 1920s and 1930s, a returned man might bring along the mother of a fallen mate and show her exactly where her son suffered his fatal wound and possibly where he had been initially buried. Sometime in the early 1970s, military instructors at the Royal Military College Duntroon suggested to the memorial's management that the plan models would make superb instructional devices for the cadets. The memorial then handed over the plan models to the Army without any fuss and with no paperwork that I ever found. These essential parts of the memorial's displays in the minds of Bean and Treloar were never seen by the public again. They were massive works, large and easily comprehended. Not all the mistakes at the memorial are of recent origins. The transfer took place without the involvement of council and without sufficient thought by senior staff. Perhaps management considered the transfer as a loan, confident that the planned models would be returned when requested. That request was never made, and at some point in time, the Army must have disposed of the memorial's property. The whole episode demonstrates the danger of the lack of care and thought. These essential parts of the memorial's display in the minds of Bean and Treloar were never seen by the public again. They were massive works, large and easily comprehended. I've said that. The transfer took place without the involvement of council and without sufficient thought by senior staff. Perhaps management considered the transfer as a loan. That request to return them was never made, and at some point in time, the Army must have disposed of the memorial's property. The whole episode demonstrates the danger of the lack of care and thought, and also the danger of ignoring the intentions and ambitions of the men whose vision of the memorial should be treated, in my view, as a sacred trust. I left the memorial in 1996 for my own business and a variety of tasks, including writing, tour guiding and consultancy. The memorial prospered in the Howard years, achieving funding we could only have dreamed of. An addition at the rear of the main building, Anzac Hall, received widespread acclaim as adding additional exhibition space without intruding at all on the nobility of the appearance of the original building. The spirit of the memorial and its way of interpreting war continued much as it had in the earlier decades and was enriched by the much greater money that was available. Then the government appointed Dr. Brendan Nelson as director. Nelson, a former senior cabinet minister in the Howard government, had become leader of the opposition on the defeat of the government at the 2007 election. Tossed out by his own party after only a few months in the job in favour of Malcolm Turnbull, Nelson quit Parliament and accepted appointment as Australian ambassador to Belgium, Luxembourg and the European Union. It surprised me to find that Nelson claimed, while in Brussels, to have made the 90-minute trip to Ypres and 90 minutes back to Brussels for the last post ceremony at least 60 times. I have been to the ceremony with my tour groups perhaps 20 times. The ceremony never changes, is quite brief, and though moving on first acquaintance, the gloss soon wears off, and it became necessary thereafter for me to seem as engaged as my first-time tourists. What Nelson got out of it on so many repetitions utterly eludes me. Visiting the memorial very occasionally during his directorship, I began to detect an increasing sentimentality or romanticism in the presentation of the exhibits and the functions of commemoration in general. This made me uncomfortable and worried. In my view, romanticism has no part in the presentation of war and the people's response to war. Teary music, text panels guiding the emotional responses of visitors, directing visitors to feel grief and sorrow, had no part in Bean or Treloar's memorial, and they should have no part today. Taking a friend from South Australia to the memorial a couple of years ago, we stopped in the introductory gallery in front of Lambert's magnificent and iconic painting, The Landing at Gallipoli. I thought I heard the sounds of gunshot and the cries of wounded men, but I was doubtful that this could be the case. Looking around me and confused, I thought I must be subconsciously adding to the mood of Lambert's painting, until looking up, I discovered a small speaker, pumping out the sounds of battle to assist the visitor in understanding what Lambert was depicting, that Australian soldiers were being shot at as they attempted to gain a foothold on the peninsula. Some of these men were dying, others were now awfully wounded. This must be the case because the sound told us so. What a horrible intrusion into the work of the painting and the intelligent visitor's interpretation of it. I told my friend to take as long as she liked in the memorial. I would sit outside in the sun and await the completion of her visit. Then came the news that the government had approved Nelson's proposal for a $500 million renewal of the memorial. Knocking over the relatively new Anzac Hall for something bigger, more dominant, to overshadow the original memorial building, giving space for massive items of military technology associated with Australia's most recent wars, providing space for the counselling and healing of veteran victims of post-traumatic stress disorder, allowing for the story of Iran and Afghanistan to dominate the ancient galleries of the past, the memorial would set out on an entirely new mission. Little did the government care, or the memorial's senior management and council take any notice of the traditions and spirit that had animated the memorial since Bean's inspired vision of 1916. Where the past is lost, the present is also at risk. Thoughtful people in the past recognised that the memorial is a special place that must be treated with enormous care and a large degree of conservatism. In 1993, I was closely involved with the reinterment of the unknown Australian soldier in the Hall of Memory. This project had been anticipated by some in the RSL even as early as the 1920s, and slowly it made its way to decision. It was Ken Inglis, a great friend of senior management at the memorial in my years there, and a cautious supporter of new developments, who told us from his careful study and observations that the Hall of Memory perplexed visitors who hesitated to enter and did not know how to read it. To some extent, the tomb of the unknown soldier was an attempt to fix this problem. But the project was years in contemplation, and once approved, was approached with a full understanding of the spirit and intent that had always animated those who cared for what Bean and Treloar had established. While there was pomp and ceremony in the funeral and the reburial, there was not a hint of sentimentality or romanticism anywhere that day. The mood was solemn, the music restrained, the intention to honour an Australian soldier and collectively all who served and died for their country in war. National cultural institutions, like universities, have their good years and their fallow years. When I think of the men and women involved in my university education at the Australian National University 1968 to 1974, I have nothing but the greatest respect and gratitude for every single one of them. And others too, like Jean de Toth, animating the student union with a sense of debate and intellectual excitement, or Colin Plowman caring for every student in trouble or difficulty, or Dr. Brian Finesse dispensing wise and caring medical support and much wisdom, or Pat White and so many others in administration. I have the view that the ANU is now in equally careful and thoughtful hands. Of course, I only know a few of the current people, most of them historians. The university appears to know its traditions and its past, and that is so good for its future. And now the name to be bestowed on the Research School of Social Sciences building. My suggestion is... Oh, sorry, I see my time has passed.